topic tonight is Albert Pike Hospital before and after. This talk was originally given to the Lodge of Perfection here in the McAlester Consistory in June of 1911. And it was not recorded at that time, and so we decided to record it, and so here we are. The Albert Pike Hospital saga lasted for 22 years and is an interesting story in McAlester Masonic history. The words before and after have a double meaning. I will give you the before and after of all of the hospitals that have served the McAlester through the years, and then the second meaning would be of the before and after deals with the building itself, how it was used before it was a hospital, and then how it was used after it was a hospital. So let's get started with the hospital scene in our city back in those years. In 1892, there were 200,000 coal miners working in this area of Indian Territory. Now let's locate 1892 in our Oklahoma history time. 1892, the second railroad, which is the East-West Road, had arrived in South McAlester 3 years previous. So by this time, the areas of Haleyville, Hartshorn, and Wilburton had just opened up for coal production, which they hadn't been doing because they didn't have any outlet. So that had increased the miners. Also, 3 years before 1892, the new territory of Oklahoma had just been organized. And then keep in mind that this was still 15 years before statehood. So that year, 1892, the first of the major mining tragedies in this area took place. The Krebs Mine number 11 explosion left over 100 dead and many more injuries. Some of the deaths could have been averted with proper hospital care. There were no actual hospitals, listen to this, there were no actual hospitals in either territory, Oklahoma Territory or Indian Territory, at this time. There were some places that they did some doctoring, but as far as being a basic hospital, there just was nothing here in the whole Oklahoma scene. The Episcopal Church, which had lagged behind most of the other Protestant churches in sending missionaries to the Indians, saw the need and opened the first hospital in McAlester called All Saints in 1895. I have read that the first seed money came from a wealthy Philadelphia Episcopal widow who was touched by the reading of the news articles of the coal mining tragedy. All Saints Hospital was located in the 700 block of West Grand, which is now Carl Albert Avenue. Right now in that location, if you'll recognize the fact that the apartment houses are now located on what was then the hospital grounds. Shortly after the hospital was established, a nurses training program was begun to supply the nurses necessary to run the hospital. All Saints was expanded 2 or 3 times and went from an original frame structure to an all brick building. 7 years later, in 1902, another hospital was opened in McAlester by Dr. Edward Troy. It was a Catholic hospital located across the street from the St. John's Catholic Church, where the Burgundy place is located now. It was called Mercy Hospital. By 1914, Doc Troy had become ill, and he petitioned the Catholic Church to take over his operation. They did, and at the same time, they gained control of the old Melvin Cornish mansion, which was out in the residential area of 2nd Ward in McAlester, on Creek between 6th and 7th Streets. So Mercy Hospital, the original Catholic hospital, disappeared, and St. Mary's began to serve the community as a Catholic hospital in 1914. Let's fast forward now to 1923. The Episcopal Church was having financial problems with All Saints. Reading between the lines, I suspect that their money tree in Philadelphia was gone. If they went out of business, listen to this, if they went out of business, the only hospital in McAlester would be a Catholic facility. Heavens to Betsy. At that time, there was much more anti-Catholic sentiment. Some Baptists would have to be treated by Catholic nuns or as nurses. That would never do. This just illustrates the prejudices that were so prevalent back in Indian Territory in those days, much more so than they are today. So a community-wide search was instigated to get someone to take over All Saints. And this is where Albert Pike, Lodge of Perfection, got in the hospital business. By assuming the long-term debt of $10,000 and the current operating debt of $3,000, the Masonic organization took over the hospital operation in 1925. The Masons operated All Saints in its original location until plans for a new building could be made, and that took 3 years. So the Lodge of Perfection Building Committee came up with 3 options for a building for this new hospital. They could rebuild All Saints on the current site, or they could build a new building. And one of the locations was the Busby property on West Jackson Street. The William Busby Mansion burned in 1917, which was 4 years after Mr. Busby died, and the Masonic organization ended up owning that land, which was a full city block. That was what his mansion was. So that was option 2. Option 3 was to remodel and expand the Masonic dormitory located right next door to the temple. This last option, was the one selected. The All Saints property and the Busby property were both sold and applied to the remodeling costs of the dormitory. So 3 years later, by 1928, the new Albert Pike Hospital was ready, and on February the 15th of that year, 24 patients were moved from All Saints to Albert Pike. A description of the new facility by the newspaper says this: "This is a first-class operation. There are 55 hospital rooms, an operating room, a beautiful lobby, and even has a special area reserved for Negro patients." Another example of prejudice back in the territories. So as the public relations move, the Masons requested that each Protestant denomination in the city nominate 3 men from their ranks, and this would create an association, which would then, a hospital board of directors would be selected from that group. The attempt was to change the image from a basic Masonic activity or operation to a community-wide operation. The nurses training program that I mentioned earlier had continued through the years at All Saints, and it was further continued at Albert Pike after the Masonic organization took over. At that time, state and federal, and that's in 1934, and when they quit the nurses training program, it was because the state and federal regulations had to be met, and most hospitals went out of the nurse training program. Albert Pike and St. Mary's then were the existing hospitals in McAlester from 1928 until 1950. The McAlester Hospital Authority in 1950 purchased the existing state mental hospital building on West Street, and the general hospital operations began. And this is when Albert Pike ceased to exist. Now, this wasn't a matter of one putting the other out of business. This was a pre-arranged things. Basically, the Masonic organization was ready to get out of the hospital business. So they were happy to go along with this plan that the hospital authority had. St. Mary's, the Catholic hospital, continued to operate until 1972. In 1972, St. Mary's was then taken over by this General Hospital group, and it was called at the time General East. Then a year later, all of the hospital consolidation was a part of a big long-range master plan to create one large regional hospital, which took place finally in 1978 with the completion of phase 1 of the McAlester Regional Hospital Complex. Now that's the basic history of the hospitals in McAlester and how the Masonic organization fit in to that time period of 22 years. Let's shift gears now and go back to the building itself, which housed Albert Pike Hospital. And that, matter of fact, the beginning of that building, when we started building that building, that started a spending spree for the McAlester Lodge of Perfection, which lasted for a decade. And I have labeled that, this is my labeling, but I labeled it the decade of spending by the McAlester Scottish Rite. So let me give you a picture of where we are back up just a little bit. In 1915, the membership of the McAlester Scottish Rite Indian Consistory was 2,545 members. Now that's pretty good when you recognize we didn't start until 1901. And so this is 2,500 members in that span of time. It was pretty good. Now, but listen to this. That was 1915, 2,500 members. By 1920, the membership had ballooned to 6,132. Wow. This was an increase of 3,587 members in 5 years. Now let me tell you what that equates to. That is an average intake of 717 new members a year for 5 years. And if you break that down further, if you had 4 reunions a year, you'd have to have 180 members in each reunion class to reach those numbers. So you can see Masonic optimism was at a peak. It was just amazing. If these numbers were projected for another 20 years, this would give the McAlester Scottish Rite a membership of over 20,000. As mentioned in the previous talks, the 4 masters were running the show, and the Venerable Master of the Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection, the forerunner of this organization, handled most of the money. And they still do. The Lodge of Perfection handles the money. Consequently, I have labeled the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, as the decade of spending by the Albert Pike Lodge of Perfection. And I mentioned that the dormitory, building of the dormitory, which we've named Albert Pike Dormitory, was the first building of this spending spree that took place. Thereafter, let me run through just a quick, they began and completed the building of a 150-room dormitory, huge, 3 times the size of the Will Rogers Dormitory in Norman, because another community need of dormitory space at the University of Oklahoma, and when the university was in its fledgling years. And so that took place, and that cost, from best I can figure, around $255,000. Then the building itself, the red brick temple building that we had during these years, was too small because of all of these influx of all these new members. Particularly the dining hall was where they couldn't crowd everybody in, and so they had decided to increase the size of the building, and they did, and that was another spending of $72,000. Then they took on this hospital project and the remodeling of the old dormitory and the bringing and the hospital furniture and the things that you have to have in a hospital that are different than the dormitory, that costs over $200,000. Now these are $1920, so that was a lot of money. And then of course the last great spending of this decade was in 1929 when we decided to build our current Masonic Temple, which is a huge structure and which was a huge expenditure of over $600,000. So really, this dormitory was the beginning of that. Anyway, so we'll get back to after the decade of the spending. So much for that. Let's get back to the building itself, which was used as I mentioned, as a dormitory from 1921 to 1925, named Albert Pike Dormitory. Now the reason that they needed this dormitory, you could see the numbers I've just mentioned to you. The incoming classes were so large, and there was not enough hotel space in the city to accommodate all these people. And so consequently, they built the dormitory to house all of these primarily candidates. And so that was the reason for the building. The hospital occupied the building. Then when they took over the hospital, as I described earlier, they occupied the building from 1928 until 1950, which was this period of 22 years. At that time, after the hospital was no longer, the building was no longer needed for a hospital, it was then remodeled again and became a dormitory again. And this time it was renamed Will Rogers Dormitory. So same basic building, except it had a lot of improvements over it. So for the next 20 years then, from 1952 to 1972, it served as a dormitory. But by that time, hotel operations in the city had increased to the point that really the dormitory was used sparingly in the last 10 years. So finally, in August of 1973, the building, many memories were demolished, and the place where many Masonic stories were swapped, and the place where many babies were born, and people were nursed back to health, was nothing more than a slab of concrete used for parking. Now this was supposed to be the end of the talk, but I have some interesting sub-stories that will take only a couple of minutes, and I think they'll embellish a little bit this hospital story. I mentioned that All Saints, the original hospital in McAlester, started a nurses training program or school, and it was continued after the Masonic organization took over. And they lasted for 6 years before they had to give it up. During that time, Bill Erkin's mother, a member of our Lodge of Perfection currently, was a graduate of that school in 1931. And the school was a 3-year course. These girls would come in and they were in this course for 3 years, and they actually lived at the hospital. So Bill has given me a copy of the program printed for her graduation class, and also she wrote a detailed description of her 3 years as a nurse trainee. Very well written and very interesting. Most of the schooling for nursing was OJT, or on-the-job training. But there were some basic classes in anatomy and physiology taught by the doctors on staff. She describes that there were 2 small frame wooden bungalows located on the backside of the hospital, which housed the nurses in training. Because of this information that he gave me is the reason, matter of fact, that I chose this topic for tonight's presentation. During my DMLA days, it was great fun to go to a DMLA meeting and then to go out on the west porch of the temple and look south, as the operating room at the hospital was directly opposite the porch, and they had a great big huge window in there, and we could stand on the porch and watch an operation in progress. Sometimes it got a little gory, but it was really quite interesting. Like many other candidates for the Blue Lodge degrees, back in those days. I learned my lectures from Elmer Hawkins in the lobby of this dormitory by the gas fireplace. My last story is very appropriate. In 1950, when the last patient was transferred out to General Hospital, they started looking for the keys to lock up the front door. There were no keys to be found because from the opening day, which was February the 15th, 1928, until September the 1st of 1950, 22 years, the front door to Albert Pike had never been locked. This concludes the story of the Masonic Hospital in McAlester. Another example of Masonic charity at work, and another reason we should be proud of our Masonic heritage. The McAlester community was in need of an additional hospital facilities, and as a public service, the McAlester Scottish Rite stepped up to the plate. Albert Pike Hospital, long gone, but long remembered. Thank you.